Even Meghan's allies couldn't escape the pressure. Journalists close to her camp were flooded with questions. PR teams scrambled behind the scenes. Should Meghan respond? Should she ignore it? Every option carried risk. If she denied it, people would demand proof. If she stayed silent, people would assume guilt. It was a classic no-win scenario. And that's why Thomas's live stream hit so hard. It didn't need to be true to be effective. It just needed to create doubt. Now let's zoom into the emotional impact. For Meghan's supporters, it felt like déjà vu. Another betrayal. Another attack from the man who was supposed to protect her. They posted messages of solidarity. "We see you, Meghan. We believe you." Some drew comparisons to toxic families everywhere, framing Meghan as a symbol for anyone who's been smeared by their own relatives. That narrative gained traction too, because it tapped into universal pain. But for skeptics, the emotional pull was different. They saw Thomas as a flawed but authentic voice. A man too bitter to lie. A father too wounded to fabricate. Why would he risk this if it weren't true? One viewer asked in a viral TikTok. That question haunted the debate, because even critics who despised Thomas couldn't answer it cleanly. Why indeed? The eruption wasn't limited to online chatter. Talk shows picked it up. Radio hosts debated it. Late-night comedians cracked jokes about Meghan Markle, aka Mystery Woman. The claims seeped into every corner of the culture until it felt like everyone had an opinion. And once a scandal reaches that point, it doesn't matter if it's fact or fiction. It's a reality in the public imagination. Now, here's the irony. Meghan and Harry had spent years fighting for control of their narrative. Carefully managed interviews, carefully crafted documentaries, strategic lawsuits. And yet, with one shaky live stream, Thomas managed to upend all of it. That's the power of an eruption. It doesn't need polish. It doesn't need strategy. It needs shock. And Thomas delivered shock in spades. The end of this chapter lies in the uncertainty. Because while the world erupted in reaction, no one had answers. What name? What papers? What proof? Theories multiplied, but facts remained scarce. And in that vacuum, the story only grew stronger. Every unanswered question became a hook. Every silence from Meghan's camp became fuel. And that's the cliffhanger. Because the eruption wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a new phase. The world had reacted. The media had amplified. But now came the real question. How credible was Thomas's claim? Could he back it up? Would Meghan fight back? And most importantly, was there more? That's where Chapter 8 takes us. Into the credibility question. Into the debate over whether Thomas was a whistleblower or just a bitter father with a grudge. Because when the public erupts, the next battle isn't about noise. It's about truth. Can we really trust Thomas Markle? That was the question on everyone's lips after his live stream detonated across the internet. Because here's the truth. A claim as explosive as Meghan wasn't always Meghan Markle doesn't live or die on the papers themselves. It lives or dies on whether the world believes the man making it. And Thomas Markle, with his messy history and complicated relationship with the truth, became the center of a credibility war unlike anything we've seen in royal drama. The hook was immediate. Critics pounced on his track record. This is the same man who staged paparazzi photos before Meghan's wedding. One commentator sneered. The same man who gave paid interviews to tabloids that trashed his daughter. For many, Thomas had already burned his credibility years ago. To them, his live stream wasn't revelation, it was desperation. A bitter father clawing for relevance, weaponizing his daughter's fame to keep his name in headlines. But the counter-argument came just as fiercely. Supporters asked, if he's such a liar, why hasn't Meghan sued him? Why hasn't she shut him down in court? It's a haunting question, because in the world of royal reputation management, silence often reads as guilt. Meghan has sued tabloids for less. She's fought misinformation tooth and nail. Yet Thomas? She's never taken him to court. That fact alone gave weight to his words for some viewers. If he were fabricating everything, wouldn't Meghan have crushed him legally by now? The middle of this credibility debate lies in Thomas's contradictions. On the one hand, he has been caught exaggerating, dramatizing, even outright embarrassing himself in the press. On the other hand, he has access. He's family. He was there for her childhood, her schooling, her early ambitions. And unlike tabloids or gossip columnists, Thomas isn't speculating. He claims to have seen the documents himself. That duality is what keeps people hooked. Because the line between bitter fabrication and buried truth is razor thin, and Thomas walks it like a tightrope. Think about it this way. Whistleblowers rarely come from happy families or trusted allies. They almost always come from the people who have the most to lose, or the most to gain. Thomas fits that mold perfectly. He's estranged, resentful, isolated. But that doesn't automatically mean he's lying. In fact, it makes him more dangerous, because he has nothing left to lose. And here's where the psychology deepens. People who distrust Meghan are predisposed to believe Thomas. People who support Meghan are predisposed to dismiss him. But the real battleground is the undecided middle, the casual observers who don't care about royal drama, who just stumbled onto the live stream out of curiosity. For them, credibility isn't about past interviews or stage photos. It's about presentation. And Thomas, whether intentionally or not, played it perfectly. Calm, steady, deliberate. He didn't rant. He didn't foam at the mouth. He delivered his accusation like a man telling the weather. And that tone gave him credibility, whether he deserved it or not. Meanwhile, the media fanned the flames. Some outlets leaned into his unreliability, framing the live stream as Thomas Markle's latest wild claim. Others highlighted his history in Hollywood, his years as a lighting director on major sets, painting him as a man who knew how the industry worked, how reinvention worked. That split coverage mirrored the public split. Was Thomas a washed-up father cashing in, or a wounded parent finally breaking his silence? The irony, of course, is that credibility in scandals like this is rarely about truth. It's about perception. If enough people believe you, your story lives. If enough people dismiss you, it dies. But Meghan's silence gave Thomas's words oxygen. Every day she didn't respond, people asked, why not? Why ignore him if he's lying? That silence made even skeptics pause. Now, let's not sugarcoat it. Thomas has baggage. His history with tabloids is messy. His decision to speak out around Meghan's wedding alienated millions. His frequent interviews have been mocked as opportunistic. But credibility isn't static. It's fluid. And when a man who's mocked as unreliable suddenly makes a claim this specific, about names, about documents, people listen. Because unreliability in the past doesn't automatically mean unreliability in the present. Sometimes, the least trusted voices deliver the most uncomfortable truths. Ask yourself, what would Thomas gain by lying? Fame. He already had that. Attention? Yes, but he also knew it would bring ridicule. Legal trouble? Possibly. Estrangement? That ship had already sailed. Which leads to the uncomfortable possibility that he wasn't lying at all, that his bitterness doesn't cancel out his access, his pain doesn't erase his memory. That possibility is why the credibility question refused to die. And here's the emotional sting. Imagine being Meghan. Your father, the man who should protect you, is now the man the world is debating like a courtroom witness. Every headline is asking, is Thomas Markle telling the truth? That's not just a scandal, it's a humiliation. A daughter's identity put on trial, with her father as the star witness. The climax of this debate came when pundits began framing Thomas as either a truth-teller silenced by elites or a serial betrayer exploiting his daughter. The polarization was complete. Half the world scoffed, half leaned in. And Meghan? Meghan said nothing. That silence became the loudest part of the story. The end of this chapter is the realization that credibility, in the digital age, doesn't require proof. It requires persistence. As long as Thomas keeps talking, as long as Meghan keeps silent, the scales of credibility tilt back and forth endlessly. Each side convinced, each side entrenched. And that's the cliffhanger. Because while the world argued about Thomas's credibility, investigators, journalists, and internet sleuths began digging deeper. If Thomas's words were true, there had to be breadcrumbs. Papers. Records. Something from Meghan's past that pointed to another name. And that digging led to the next phase of the story, the hunt into Meghan's early life. That's where Chapter 9 takes us. Into the past. Into the schools, the records, the whispers of classmates and teachers. Into the place where contradictions start to take shape. Because whether Thomas is credible or not, one question now drives everything. Do the records back him up? The present may be polished, but the past always leaves footprints. And after Thomas Markle's livestream, the world suddenly became obsessed with retracing Meghan Markle's. If she wasn't always Meghan Markle, as her father claimed. Then the truth had to be hidden in the places she thought were forgotten. Classrooms, yearbooks, dusty school files, whispers from old acquaintances. It was a scavenger hunt through memory and paperwork, and every clue became a weapon in the battle over her identity. The hook came fast. Internet sleuths flooded forums and social media with evidence. Old yearbooks resurfaced. Class photos were scanned and magnified. Handwritten signatures were compared like forensic exhibits. Some pointed to subtle variations. Meghan sometimes signing Rachel, her legal first name, other times Meghan. Others claimed her surname appeared differently on early documents. Nothing was conclusive, but in the digital courtroom of public opinion, even faint hints became smoking guns. Here's the irony. Meghan has never hidden the fact that her first name is Rachel. Her full legal name is Rachel Meghan Markle. But the detail Thomas dangled about other names on papers made people look at even ordinary facts differently. Suddenly, a child signing Rachel M. on a paper wasn't just a normal variation. It was, to conspiracy-hungry minds, a clue. The simplest details became loaded. The ordinary became extraordinary. The middle of this digging lies in the contradictions. Meghan has shared stories about her upbringing, growing up in Los Angeles, attending Immaculate Heart High School, later Northwestern University. These details are well documented. Teachers, classmates, even administrators have spoken warmly about her. But Thomas's claim cast a shadow. If she'd used another name on forms, could those warm memories have been tied to someone other than Meghan Markle? Could her classmates have known her as someone else, without realizing they were sitting beside a girl who would later become royalty? Think about the emotional punch of that possibility. Imagine leafing through an old yearbook and realizing the person who became one of the most famous women in the world had been hiding in plain sight under another name. It reframes everything. Every smile in a photo, every anecdote shared by a friend, every teacher's note on a report card, all suddenly loaded with mystery. And then there's the haunting question, why? Why would a young Meghan feel the need to shift names on papers? Was it rebellion against one parent? Was it a way of distancing herself from Thomas? Was it a tool for ambition, a way to sculpt a persona, even as a child? Or was it something deeper, an intentional erasure of a past she wanted to bury? These questions lingered as journalists began sniffing around her old schools, her early neighborhoods, her forgotten circles. The digging didn't stop at paperwork. Former classmates popped up on talk shows and podcasts. Some swore Meghan was exactly who she said she was. Others hinted at inconsistencies, different nicknames, different versions of her story depending on the audience. One former acquaintance reportedly described her as always rehearsing, as though she were playing a part even in her teenage years. That phrase struck a chord, because it echoed Thomas's accusation that Meghan wasn't just growing, she was reinventing. The media amplified these voices, turning every offhand comment into a headline. Former classmate says Meghan was different back then. Did Meghan go by another name in high school? Each article fed the frenzy, and the frenzy fed the clicks. Meanwhile, Meghan's defenders pointed out that millions of people use different names growing up. Some use middle names. Some adopt nicknames. Some switch between parents' surnames, depending on the situation. They argued this was normal, harmless, nothing sinister. But critics pushed back. Normal is a nickname at home. This was paperwork, legal documents. That's not harmless, that's identity. And that's where the emotional stakes soared. Because the debate wasn't really about what name Meghan signed on a school slip. It was about trust. If the name story was true, it meant Meghan had curated her identity for decades. It meant every reinvention, every story told in interviews, was part of a larger performance. And if it was false, it meant her father was willing to drag her past through the mud for his own revenge. Either way, the digging exposed a wound that couldn't be ignored. The climax of this chapter came when investigative reporters began requesting records. School archives, legal filings, anything that might confirm or deny Thomas's claim. Most institutions stayed silent, citing privacy laws. But silence only fueled suspicion. If there's nothing to hide, why won't they release the records? Skeptics asked. The absence of answers became its own kind of answer. And that's the paradox of scandals like this. Proof rarely surfaces quickly. But in the meantime, speculation thrives. People don't wait for documents. They build theories out of shadows. And once enough people believe, shadows become fact in the public imagination. The emotional core of this digging is the image of Meghan's past being pried open like a locked chest. Every teacher's memory, every classmate's story, every smudge of handwriting suddenly mattered. Imagine Meghan watching this unfold, her childhood dissected, her youth treated like evidence in a trial she never agreed to. It's not just invasive, it's destabilizing. A woman who spent years shaping her narrative now finds her earliest chapters being rewritten by others. And here's the cliffhanger. Amid all the digging, whispers emerged of something bigger. That maybe the alternate name wasn't just a quirk of childhood, but a clue tied to a broader pattern, documents beyond school records. Legal papers, medical forms, records that, if uncovered, would force the world to confront a darker question. Was Meghan's reinvention simply ambition, or was it concealment? By now, you're probably asking, what name did the papers say? Was it Rachel, Meghan's legal first name? Was it something tied to her mother's side of the family? Was it a completely different surname altogether? Thomas wouldn't say, and that's what makes this revelation so powerful. He dangled the possibility, but refused the detail. And that refusal keeps the audience hooked, desperate for more. It's almost cruel, isn't it? To tell the world, I've seen the papers, but never hold them up. To confirm the existence of proof, but never show it. To whisper about a secret, but never reveal the word itself. It's like showing a locked chest and promising there's treasure inside, but never handing over the key. And in scandals, that's the perfect recipe for obsession. As the live stream replayed across social media, people latched onto this childhood papers claim. Some speculated about Meghan's school years. Others dug into yearbooks, looking for signatures, for clues. A few claimed to have inside knowledge, fueling rumors about alternate surnames. And every theory, every rumor, every wild guess only added fuel to the fire Thomas had lit. And here's the final twist of this chapter. Thomas hinted that the papers didn't just show a name. They hinted at a reinvention that was planned. A young girl preparing to become someone else, someone bigger, someone global. He suggested this wasn't an accident of paperwork, it was the start of a pattern. A breadcrumb that led all the way to Buckingham Palace. And that's where we end this chapter. With the haunting image of old papers sitting in a file somewhere. Papers that may or may not confirm the truth. Papers that Thomas claims to have seen, that Meghan would never want exposed. Papers that leave us all asking, was the Meghan Markle the world fell in love with simply a character, carefully constructed from childhood? Because if the papers are real, if the name is real, then the reinvention didn't begin in Hollywood. It began in a school office, with a pen, on ordinary paper. And what came next, nobody saw coming. Reinvention. It's a word we usually celebrate. We praise people who reinvent themselves, who rise from nothing, who turn failure into triumph. Hollywood thrives on it. Politics depends on it. Even the royal family, with all its rigid traditions, has seen members reinvent their images to survive the tides of public opinion. But when Thomas Markle accused his daughter of living under a name that wasn't always her own, he wasn't just talking about reinvention. He was talking about reinvention on a scale so deep, so intentional, it felt like a rewriting of history. And that's the story that shakes people to their core. The idea that Meghan Markle may not just have reinvented her life, but her very identity. Let's start where it always begins, childhood. Meghan grew up in Los Angeles, the daughter of Thomas Markle, a lighting director who worked on television sets, and Doria Ragland, a yoga instructor and social worker. On the surface, her early years seemed unremarkable, but as Thomas tells it, there was already something brewing beneath the surface. A hunger, an ambition, a desire to be bigger than the life she had. Nothing unusual there. Many kids dream of something greater. But combine ambition with reinvention, and you get a very different trajectory. The school papers Thomas referenced in his live stream, those were, in his telling, the first breadcrumbs of this reinvention. A name written differently. A choice that looked small at the time, but carried enormous symbolic weight. It was the first rehearsal for a role that would eventually become global. Now, let's trace the arc. Meghan's early years in school paint the picture of a bright, articulate student. Teachers often praised her writing, her confidence, her ability to command attention. But alongside that came a growing awareness of image. Friends remember her as someone who paid attention to how she presented herself, her style, her speech, even her mannerisms. Little things, sure, but signs of someone already shaping a narrative about who they were. Fast forward to her years at Northwestern University. This is where the reinvention story accelerates. Meghan wasn't just a student. She was positioning herself for Hollywood, networking, auditioning, molding her persona. And that's where her name, Meghan Markle, became the foundation of her brand. Clean, simple, memorable, marketable. If Thomas is right, this wasn't just a name she carried forward. It was a deliberate selection, a rebranding that would erase whatever came before. Think about it. Hollywood is ruthless. Names matter. Some stars change theirs for glamour, others for simplicity. But Meghan's alleged reinvention went further. According to Thomas, it wasn't just a cosmetic tweak. It was a whole new layer of identity, crafted to fit the story she wanted the world to believe. She was always preparing for something bigger, Thomas said. And that line hits like a hammer, because it reframes every step of her life as part of a larger plan. The middle of this story is where it gets fascinating. Meghan's acting career didn't begin with fame. It began with small roles, walk-ons, background characters. But even then, she was reinventing herself. From her look to her voice to her demeanor, she was sculpting a version of Meghan that was polished, ambitious, ready to rise. And when she landed Suits, that reinvention paid off. Suddenly, Meghan Markle wasn't just a name. It was a brand of intelligence, sophistication, modern elegance. But Thomas insists that this was only phase 2 of the reinvention. Phase 1, he says, started with those childhood papers. Phase 2 came in Hollywood. And phase 3? That was royalty. Let's pause and think about the scale of that. How many people reinvent themselves so completely that they go from being an actress in cable television to a duchess in the British monarchy? Very few. It takes extraordinary ambition, extraordinary calculation, and, if Thomas is right, extraordinary concealment of the past. The reinvention story is laced with irony. Meghan has often spoken publicly about authenticity, about finding her true voice, about rejecting labels others place on her. Yet here is Thomas, claiming the very opposite, that Meghan's public identity is itself a label, carefully chosen, carefully constructed, carefully guarded. That the real Meghan, the name on those childhood papers, was left behind long ago. And here's where it cuts deep. Reinvention is powerful when it's transparent. When people know your old story, they admire your rise. But when reinvention is hidden, when it's tied to secrecy, people start to ask uncomfortable questions. What was wrong with the old identity? Why erase it? What did you want to hide? That's the contradiction at the heart of this chapter. Meghan Markle's success is built on a narrative of authenticity and resilience. But if her father's claims about her reinvention are true, then authenticity might be the very thing missing. Picture it. Meghan in the palace, dressed in couture, cameras flashing, titles bestowed. Millions watching, millions admiring. And yet, behind that polished facade, Thomas suggests there's another story. A story of a girl who quietly reinvented herself on paper and never looked back. A story of a woman who made her life's project not just to climb, but to conceal. The public, of course, thrives on contradictions like this. That's why Meghan's reinvention story resonates so powerfully. It forces people to confront the possibility that the fairy tale was a fabrication, that the rise wasn't just unlikely, it was engineered. And that's why Thomas's claim carries weight. Not because we know the other name, not because we've seen the papers, but because the arc of Meghan's life fits the pattern of reinvention he describes. Let's bring this down to a personal level. Ask yourself, how many times have you reinvented yourself? Maybe when you switched schools, maybe when you started a new job, maybe when you moved to a new city. Reinvention is human. But now ask yourself, did you erase your name? Did you bury your past? Did you construct a new identity so thoroughly that even your own father feels compelled to expose it? That's where Meghan's story becomes not just unusual, but extraordinary. As the live stream replayed online, analysts and commentators latched onto this idea of reinvention. Some praised Meghan, saying reinvention is survival, especially for women of color in industries stacked against them. Others condemned her, saying reinvention was deception, a manipulation of public sympathy. Both sides missed the point Thomas was making. That reinvention isn't just Meghan's story. It's her secret weapon and her most dangerous liability. And here's where the cliffhanger emerges. Thomas didn't just suggest that Meghan reinvented herself. He suggested she reinvented herself so thoroughly, so deliberately, that even her family was left behind. He painted the reinvention not as empowerment, but as betrayal. She wasn't just becoming someone else, he said. She was leaving someone behind. Who was that someone? The child on the childhood papers? The daughter he thought he knew? The girl who once went by another name? We don't know. Not yet. But Thomas insists the reinvention wasn't harmless. It was calculated. And that's the detail that pulls us into the next chapter. Because if Chapter 5 is about reinvention as a pattern, Chapter 6 is about the breaking point. The moment Thomas says he couldn't stay silent anymore. The moment the reinvention stopped being personal and became public. The moment he decided that the world needed to see Meghan not as a duchess, not as a Hollywood star, but as the girl who had buried her past and betrayed her family. And what happens when a father reaches his breaking point? That's where this story turns from revelation to explosion. What makes a father turn on his daughter in front of the entire world? That's the question millions were asking the moment Thomas Markle hit go live and began dismantling Meghan's carefully constructed story. For years, he had stayed mostly quiet. Yes, he gave interviews here and there, sometimes critical, sometimes bitter, but never like this. Never this sharp, this specific, this personal. Something pushed him past the breaking point. Something made him decide that silence was no longer an option. And that's where this chapter begins, with the unraveling of Thomas's restraint. From the very first second of his live stream, it was clear this wasn't an offhand rant. This was a calculated decision, born of years of tension, rejection, and frustration. He leaned into the camera and said, "Enough is enough." And those words didn't come from nowhere. They came from years of watching, waiting, and, in his mind, being betrayed by his daughter. Let's rewind. The estrangement between Meghan and her father has been public knowledge for years. Their relationship collapsed around the time of her wedding to Prince Harry in 2018. Thomas staged paparazzi photos, a move he later admitted was a mistake, and then he suffered a heart attack days before walking her down the aisle. Meghan reportedly cut off contact. From there, the distance grew. Lawsuits, interviews, leaked letters, it all painted a picture of a father and daughter permanently divided. And yet, through all of that, Thomas never went this far. He criticized Meghan, yes. He expressed anger, yes. But he never attacked the foundation of her identity. So why now? Why this live stream? Why the nuclear option? The answer, if you listen carefully to his words, lies in three forces: personal pain, public humiliation, and legal pressure. First, personal pain. For any parent, being cut out of your child's life is devastating. But for Thomas, it wasn't just distance, it was erasure. He claimed in the live stream that Meghan had rewritten her story to the point where he no longer existed in it. Interviews, documentaries, royal narratives, she rarely mentioned him. And when she did, it was often in ways that painted him as the villain. For a man who helped raise her, who says he supported her ambitions, who claims he remembers every childhood milestone, that erasure cut like a knife. "She acts like I was never there," he muttered during the stream. That bitterness was palpable. Second, public humiliation. For years, Thomas has been portrayed in the media as the embarrassing father. The man who sold photos to tabloids. The man who gave too many interviews. The man who, in Meghan's telling, couldn't be trusted. And for Thomas, every headline felt like salt in the wound. The world saw him as a clown, a liability. But in his mind, he wasn't the villain. He was the keeper of secrets. And eventually, he decided to flip the script. Instead of being humiliated, he would do the humiliating. Third, legal pressure. This was the trigger we explored in Chapter 2, the lawsuit filings. Thomas believed those documents contained inconsistencies that proved Meghan's reinvention went deeper than the world realized. To him, the filings weren't just words on paper. They were proof that the truth was straining to break through. And he decided to be the one to crack it open. Put those three forces together: personal pain, public humiliation, legal pressure, and you get a man ready to detonate. Ready to take the one thing he had left, his knowledge of Meghan's past, and weaponize it. The middle of this story is about the psychology of that decision. Imagine being Thomas Markle. Your daughter is one of the most famous women in the world. She's a duchess, a global celebrity, a figure of endless fascination. But you're shut out of her life. You're painted as the problem. You're mocked by tabloids. And all the while, you're sitting on documents, memories, secrets that could change the narrative. Would you stay silent forever? Or would you eventually break? Thomas broke. And when he did, his words carried the weight of years of silence. He wasn't just exposing Meghan's alleged alternate name. He was exposing his own pain. You could hear it in his voice. The tremor, the pauses, the bitterness. This wasn't just about papers. It was about betrayal. A father who felt abandoned, erased, replaced. She acts like she was raised by strangers, he said at one point. But I was there. I was always there. That's where the emotional punch lands. Because whether you believe him or not, it's clear Thomas isn't just talking about identity. He's talking about fatherhood, about the heartbreak of watching your child become someone you no longer recognize, about the fury of feeling like your love, your sacrifices, your presence have been scrubbed out of history. But here's the contradiction. While Thomas claims he's exposing the truth out of duty, out of a desire for honesty, critics argue it's about revenge. That this isn't about integrity, it's about payback. That Thomas isn't protecting the world from deception. He's punishing his daughter for abandoning him. And that tension is what makes his live stream so powerful. Because it leaves the audience divided. Is Thomas a whistleblower? Or a bitter man grasping for relevance? That's the hook. That's the drama. And Thomas knew it. The end of this chapter comes with the most chilling realization. Thomas doesn't see this as the end. He sees it as the beginning. He hinted repeatedly that he had more to share. More documents. More stories. More secrets. He framed his live stream as the opening shot in a longer war. This isn't the last you'll hear from me, he said. The truth always comes out. And that's the cliffhanger. Because if Thomas has more to reveal, what's next? If the alternate name was only the first strike, what's the second? What's the third? How deep does this go? That's where we're headed. Because the live stream wasn't just a father's outburst. It was a declaration of war. A war not just between Thomas and Meghan, but between two competing versions of the truth. And in Chapter 7, we'll see how the world reacted, how the public, the media, and even Meghan's allies processed the explosion of doubt. Because Thomas may have spoken out. But the question now is, who's willing to believe him? The live stream ended with a click, but the storm it unleashed was only just beginning. Within seconds, Thomas Markle's words were ricocheting across the internet, turning into headlines, hashtags, and heated debates. It wasn't just a ripple, it was an eruption. The kind of moment where public opinion fractures, where narratives collide, where the noise becomes deafening. And Meghan Markle, whether she wanted to or not, was at the center of it all. The hook came instantly. Screenshots of Thomas's face, frozen mid-sentence, flooded social media. The quote, "She wasn't always Meghan Markle," was plastered across Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Some added fire emojis. Others added laughing faces. The internet thrives on sound bites, and Thomas had delivered one tailor-made for virality. The first wave of reactions was shock. People who had tuned in casually or stumbled across clips afterward couldn't believe what they were hearing. Wait, what did he just say? One user tweeted, racking up thousands of likes. Others jumped in with memes. Meghan's face photoshopped onto mystery movie posters, captions like, "Who is she really?" or "Coming soon. The woman with no name." The humor didn't dilute the claim. It amplified it. Because when something becomes a meme, it becomes cultural currency. The second wave was outrage. Meghan's defenders were quick to condemn Thomas. "This is abuse," one commentator posted. "Imagine your own father trying to erase you." Others called it exploitation, accusing Thomas of using Meghan's name to grab attention and money. Prominent voices weighed in. Activists, celebrities, journalists. They framed Thomas's words as cruel, vindictive, the desperate act of a man jealous of his daughter's success. But then came the third wave, and it was the most dangerous for Meghan: curiosity. Even those who despised Thomas couldn't help but wonder. What did he mean? What name was he talking about? Were there really papers? The more people tried to dismiss it, the more others leaned in. Because doubt, once planted, is nearly impossible to uproot. And Thomas hadn't just planted doubt. He had watered it, fed it, and left it to grow. The middle of this eruption is where the media stepped in. Tabloids had a field day. Headlines screamed about Meghan's secret name and the identity bombshell. Every outlet from the Daily Mail to smaller gossip blogs churned out articles within hours. Some quoted Thomas directly. Others speculated wildly. Few had facts, but all had traffic. And in the digital age, traffic is everything. Mainstream outlets, on the other hand, try to tread carefully. They framed it as Thomas Markle's latest claim, noting his history of controversial statements. But even cautionary coverage spreads a story. Every time they wrote, Thomas alleges Meghan used another name. They were reinforcing the possibility in readers' minds. That's how rumors work. They don't need proof, they need oxygen. And the media provided plenty of it. Meanwhile, Meghan's critics latched on. Online forums buzzed with theories. Some dug into old yearbooks, trying to match signatures. Others trawled through archives, searching for inconsistencies in her story. Conspiracy threads exploded with speculation. Maybe Meghan had reinvented herself multiple times. Maybe her past was more complicated than anyone realized. These theories ranged from plausible to absurd, but they all had one thing in common. They kept the conversation alive. You could hear it in his livestream. This wasn't casual frustration, it was righteous fury. He felt the lawsuit forced his hand. Because if Meghan's name, history, or identity were even slightly inconsistent with what she built her empire on, then Thomas believed the public deserved to know. He framed it not as revenge, but as duty, almost like a whistleblower. And in his mind, staying silent while Meghan's version dominated courtrooms, headlines, and Netflix specials wasn't just cowardice, it was complicity. But here's where things get even more layered. Legal filings aren't written in plain English. They're designed to be technical, precise, and often vague enough to protect clients. Which means Thomas might have interpreted something in them through his own lens, his own hurt, his own memories. But perception matters. And when perception mixes with personal pain, it becomes combustible. That's exactly what happened here. Let me ask you this. Have you ever seen a celebrity's court documents leak online? People scour them for hours, circling words, highlighting contradictions, drawing conclusions that might not even exist. It's human nature to connect dots, even when they're scattered. Now imagine being Thomas Markle. Those aren't just dots to him. Those are pieces of his own life, his own daughter, his own story. To him, the lawsuit wasn't abstract, it was personal. And so, in his mind, there were two choices: remain silent or expose what he saw as the missing puzzle piece. He chose exposure. Middle of the live stream, when Thomas began referencing the lawsuit, you could see how heavy it weighed on him. His face hardened, his words sharpened. He said, "I've stayed quiet while she twisted stories in courtrooms. But these filings? They crossed a line. They prove she's been hiding the truth." Did he ever hold up the papers? No. Did he read line by line? No. But he didn't have to. The mere mention of a legal trigger was enough to make the public's ears perk up. Because lawsuits come with one unique element: accountability. If you lie under oath, if you misrepresent yourself, it isn't just embarrassing, it's criminal. And Thomas was subtly suggesting that Meghan's carefully curated identity might not withstand that kind of scrutiny. Now let's dig deeper into why this was so explosive. Meghan's critics have always accused her of being a social climber, of reinventing herself to climb higher. But reinvention in Hollywood is expected. You can change your style, your friends, even your accent. Nobody bats an eye. What you can't change, at least not without serious consequences, are your legal records. If Thomas's claim was even partially true, it meant Meghan's entire narrative could be vulnerable in court. And that made the lawsuit more than a legal battle. It made it a minefield. Think about the irony. Meghan and Harry have spent years fighting legal battles against tabloids, against privacy invasions, against institutions they say misrepresented them. And yet, in the middle of one of those very battles, Thomas steps forward to claim Meghan herself misrepresented who she even was. It's the perfect contradiction, the perfect storm. And it's why this chapter of the story matters. At this point, the audience watching Thomas wasn't just curious about Meghan's supposed other name. They were curious about the lawsuit itself. What did it say? What was hidden in those dense paragraphs? The mystery doubled. First, Meghan's identity. Second, the filings that supposedly exposed it. That's retention gold, Because now viewers weren't just waiting for Thomas's next line. They were waiting to see if journalists, investigators, or even the courts themselves would pull the threads he had dangled. And here's the kicker. Thomas knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't need to dump documents on screen. He didn't need to show Exhibit A. By linking Meghan's alleged hidden identity to a lawsuit, he created a self-sustaining loop. Reporters would dig. Lawyers would be asked. Analysts would speculate. And his claim would echo long after the live stream ended. He dropped the bait and let the world do the fishing. The build-up of this chapter isn't about the filings themselves. It's about their symbolic power. They represented permanence, proof, something larger than a father's word. And that's why Thomas latched onto them. In his mind, they weren't just papers. They were the catalyst, the match that set his silence ablaze. So let's ask the obvious question. What exactly in those filings set him off? Was it a reference to Meghan's schooling? A signature under a different name? A detail about her past employment? We may never know the exact line. But we do know this. Thomas made it sound like the filings validated what he had been claiming privately for years. To him, they weren't just words. They were confirmation. And that's why he finally went live. But here's where the story twists again. By tying his revelation to a lawsuit, Thomas also raised the stakes for himself. If Meghan's team wanted to, they could challenge him legally. They could demand he produce the documents. They could accuse him of slander or defamation. He knew this risk. He said as much. "I know what I'm saying could get me in trouble," he admitted during the stream. "But I'd rather face that than keep pretending." That statement alone adds weight. Because whether you believe him or not, it paints the picture of a man willing to risk his own skin just to expose what he sees as the truth. And in the court of public opinion, that kind of boldness often lands harder than facts. The live stream ended, but the questions didn't. Instead, they multiplied. What was in those filings? What name was Thomas talking about? Would Meghan's team respond? And most chilling of all, if Thomas was right, how deep did the reinvention go? That's where we leave this chapter. With the lawsuit as the trigger, the spark, the moment the fire caught. Dry papers transformed into a scandal. A father's silence shattered. And a global audience left staring at the wreckage, desperate for answers. Because the filings weren't the story. They were the doorway. And stepping through that doorway takes us to the revelation that stunned everyone. The name nobody expected. And that's where we're headed next. What's in a name? Shakespeare asked that question centuries ago, but tonight it feels like the whole world is asking it again. Except this time the subject isn't a rose, it's Meghan Markle. When Thomas Markle leaned into the camera and declared, she wasn't always Meghan Markle. It wasn't just a throwaway remark. It was a dagger aimed directly at the identity Meghan has built her empire upon. And if he's telling the truth, the name the world knows. The name on every headline, every Netflix special, every royal biography, might not even be her own. Let that sink in for a moment. Imagine realizing that the woman introduced to us as Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, the Hollywood actress turned royal icon, may have once answered to something entirely different on official documents. Not a stage name, not a screen credit, but paperwork. The dry, bureaucratic, ink-on-paper kind of name that follows you for life. The shock wasn't just in Thomas's words. It was in the implication. Because names aren't just labels. They're anchors. They tie you to your history, your family, your past. Change your hairstyle? Nobody cares. Change your accent? Interesting, but forgettable. Change your name on legal documents? That's different. That suggests reinvention on a scale so deep it borders on erasure. And that's exactly what Thomas was hinting at. In the live stream, Thomas stopped short of saying the exact name. He teased. He dangled. He built suspense like a storyteller who knows the climax is more powerful when the audience leans in, begging for it. But the hints were enough to ignite imaginations worldwide. Was it her mother's surname? Was it a nickname turned official? Was it something tied to a step-parent? Theories spread like wildfire, each more sensational than the last. But here's the chilling part. Whatever the name was, Thomas swore it wasn't Meghan Markle. And that claim alone planted doubt. Doubt that rippled out of the live stream and into tabloids, forums, even living rooms. Doubt that made people ask the one question Meghan has always dreaded. Who is she, really? Let's zoom out for a second. Meghan Markle has always been portrayed as a woman who carefully managed her story. From Suits to Oprah, from podcasts to documentaries, Every step of her career has been about image. Her name became her brand. It's clean. It's memorable. It's marketable. But if Thomas is right, then that brand might be built on a foundation of sand. Because the moment you introduce the idea of another name, the entire narrative becomes unstable. It forces people to wonder, what else has been curated? What else has been hidden? Now, I want you to imagine this from Meghan's perspective. You've spent years building a life as Meghan Markle. You've married into one of the most famous families in the world. Your name is now literally tied to royalty. And then, in one live stream, your estranged father looks into the camera and hints that the name everyone knows isn't the full truth. The betrayal cuts deep, not just because of what he said, but because of how it undermines everything you've built. It's not just personal, it's existential. The middle portion of Thomas's revelation was where the real suspense lived. He described seeing the papers, holding the documents. He talked about a time when Meghan was younger, when her life wasn't yet in the global spotlight. He never gave dates. He never specified which institution. But he painted enough of a picture for people to fill in the blanks themselves. I've seen it with my own eyes, he insisted. The world thinks it knows Meghan Markle. But that wasn't always her name. Think about how deliberately he phrased that. He didn't say Meghan changed her name later. He didn't say she used a nickname. He said, that wasn't always her name. Past tense. Definitive. Suggesting that the woman we call Meghan Markle might be, in some sense, a creation. A later version. And that's why the live stream's audience couldn't let go. Because names carry power. Ask yourself, how would you feel if you discovered your favorite celebrity, politician, or even a close friend had once gone by a completely different legal name, never disclosed it, and built an empire on the new identity? Would you shrug it off? Or would you start to question everything they've ever told you? That's the emotional bomb Thomas planted. The internet, of course, went wild with speculation. Some believed it was a middle name swap. Others thought it might tie back to her mother's side of the family. A few conspiracy theories even floated the idea of Meghan using a completely unrelated surname for a period of time. And while many of these theories veered into the absurd, the fact remains, Thomas had opened Pandora's box. Once the idea of another name was out there, it couldn't be stuffed back in. Here's where the psychology kicks in. Humans crave consistency. We like neat, tidy narratives. Meghan Markle's story, California girl turned actress turned royal, fits neatly into a narrative arc. But Thomas's revelation shatters that arc. It introduces contradiction. And contradiction forces curiosity. Curiosity forces attention. That's why, even after the live stream ended, people were replaying it, analyzing his tone, dissecting his words. Because once you suspect someone might not be who they've presented themselves as, you can't unhear it. Thomas himself seemed to relish that tension. He didn't shout. He didn't wave papers in front of the camera. He leaned back, calm, as if to say, you don't believe me? Fine. But you'll see. That confidence made it worse for Meghan. Because it suggested he had more. That this wasn't just a bitter father's rant. It was a breadcrumb. And breadcrumbs, and scandals, always lead somewhere. The end of this chapter in the live stream was perhaps the most haunting. Thomas didn't reveal the actual name. He didn't need to. He left it hanging in the air, like smoke after a firework. I know who she really is, he said. And the papers prove it. With that, he ended his thought, leaving millions suspended in uncertainty. And that's the genius, or cruelty, of it. By withholding the name, Thomas gave the story infinite life. If he had blurted it out, people might have fact-checked, debated, moved on. But by keeping it vague, he created a vacuum. And vacuums beg to be filled, with theories, with debates, with endless speculation. That's why this wasn't just a revelation. It was a masterstroke in scandal building. But here's the cliffhanger. Thomas didn't just stop at the name. He hinted, just hinted, that the documents tied to it weren't simple school records. He suggested they might connect to something far bigger. Something that explained why Meghan reinvented herself so thoroughly, why she left pieces of her past behind. He didn't say what. He didn't say how. But he made sure his audience knew there was more beneath the surface. And that's where we're headed next. Because if Chapter 3 is about the name nobody expected, then Chapter 4 is about the documents themselves. The so-called childhood papers Thomas swears prove everything. And those papers, if real, could change the story forever. Paper. Ordinary, everyday paper. Crumpled, folded, yellowed with time. Most of us never think twice about it. Old-school records stuffed into drawers, medical slips shoved into folders, birth certificates hidden in safety deposit boxes. But sometimes, paper isn't just paper. Sometimes, paper is power. Sometimes, it's proof. And according to Thomas Markle, it's paper, childhood papers, to be exact, that hold the key to unraveling Meghan Markle's real identity. When Thomas leaned into his live stream and spoke about seeing the documents, he wasn't talking about gossip columns or tabloid stories. He was talking about ink on paper. Real, tangible records from Meghan's youth. School forms. Legal filings. The bureaucratic breadcrumbs of a life before fame. And in his telling, those papers didn't say Meghan Markle. They said something else. Something that, if revealed, would shatter the story the world thinks it knows. Imagine this. A dusty filing cabinet in a California school office, tucked away behind years of forgotten folders. A secretary pulling a file marked with Meghan's year. Inside, attendance slips, report cards, permission slips, each bearing a name that doesn't match the one etched into global memory. It's a simple scenario, but a devastating one. Because childhood papers don't lie. They're not carefully branded press releases. They're not stage credits. They're not polished interviews. They're raw, bureaucratic truth. And that's what Thomas was hinting at. He claimed to have held those papers in his hands. He claimed to remember the name written on them. He claimed that long before Meghan Markle became Meghan Markle, she was someone else on record. And he insisted this wasn't just a slip of a pen. It wasn't a clerical error. It was deliberate. Now let's pause. Why does this matter so much? Because childhood papers are anchors in a person's life story. You can reinvent yourself in adulthood. Actors do it all the time. Politicians, too. But your school records? Your early legal documents? Those are supposed to be unshakable. They tie you to your roots. They're the receipts of who you were before the world was watching. If Thomas is right, Meghan didn't just reinvent herself later. She started rewriting the narrative in her youth. The middle of this chapter lies in the implications. If Meghan used another name on childhood documents, what does that say about her? Was it a family decision? Was it a rebellion? Was it an attempt to align with one parent over another? Or was it something darker, an intentional erasure of part of her identity to make space for the one she wanted to construct later? These are the haunting questions that Thomas's claim stirs up. Let's play out one scenario. Picture Meghan in middle school, filling out a form. Maybe she's asked to write her name on a standardized test. Maybe she's signing up for extracurricular activities. But instead of Meghan Markle, she writes something else. Why? Maybe it was a name she felt gave her more legitimacy. Maybe it was a name she thought would open doors. Or maybe it was a name she was told to use. Imagine the psychology of that moment. A young girl already rehearsing the art of reinvention, long before Hollywood scripts and royal pageantry. And then think about Thomas. A father watching this unfold. Maybe he didn't question it at the time. Maybe he thought it was harmless. But as years passed, as Meghan's fame skyrocketed, as she presented herself as authentically Meghan Markle, those papers would have weighed heavier and heavier in his mind. Until one day he snapped. Until one day, a lawsuit triggered the memory. Until one day, he looked at the camera and said, "I've seen the papers. I know the truth." That's where the emotional twist comes in. Because whether you believe Thomas or not, there's an undeniable tragedy in the image of a father clutching old documents like evidence in a trial against his own daughter. It's not just scandal, it's heartbreak. A family tearing itself apart, with paperwork as the weapon. Now here's the chilling irony. Meghan Markle has always spoken about her childhood, about the struggles of being biracial, about the challenges of being underestimated, about the journey of finding her voice. Those stories, those anecdotes, form the backbone of her public persona. They make her relatable. They make her human. But if Thomas's claim about the childhood papers is true, then those stories might be missing a crucial detail. The fact that she wasn't even Meghan Markle on record at the time. And that's the contradiction the public can't ignore. Because once you question the authenticity of someone's childhood story, you question everything that comes after. Every speech, every interview, every carefully curated moment. What if I told you the Meghan Markle the world thinks it knows might not even exist? Imagine watching a live video where her own father, Thomas Markle, suddenly declares that his daughter, the Duchess of Sussex, the woman who shook the royal family, once used a completely different name on official papers. Not for a Hollywood audition, not for a stage credit, but on legal or school documents, years before she became Meghan Markle. That's the bombshell Thomas just dropped. And if it's true, it doesn't just raise eyebrows. It shakes the very foundation of her carefully crafted identity. Because the question is no longer just about Meghan's behavior, her marriage, or her role in the royal family. It's about something much more haunting. Who is she really? The screen flickered. Thomas Markle sat there, his voice trembling at first, but then steady with a kind of quiet fury that only a parent who feels betrayed could summon. "Enough is enough," he said, staring directly into the camera. "The world needs to know who my daughter really is." Now, let's pause for a second. Imagine being in the live chat. Imagine hearing those words. Your heart rate picks up, your curiosity spikes. Because Thomas wasn't rambling, he wasn't muttering half-truths. He was deliberate. He wanted to make sure his message landed like a thunderclap. And it did. Within minutes, clips of the live stream were circulating. Headlines were brewing. And everyone was asking the same thing. What secret name? What papers? And what on earth was Meghan hiding? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Before we unpack that, let's rewind the tape. Meghan Markle's story has always been presented as the modern fairy tale. A California-born actress with mixed heritage, breaking barriers and falling in love with a prince. It's the storyline Netflix sold, the one tabloids both worshipped and attacked, the story Meghan herself leaned into. But if Thomas is to be believed, that story might just be one polished version of a much messier reality. Because, according to him, there were names, identities, and documents that don't line up with the person we think we know today. And that's where this story takes a darker turn. Reinvention? Sure, that's Hollywood. But reinvention tied to official documents? That's something else. That's not just branding. That's identity. Picture this. Years ago, in the fluorescent-lit halls of a Los Angeles school, paperwork is filed. A name is scribbled, but it isn't Meghan Markle. It's something else. Maybe a variation. Maybe a completely different alias. We don't know yet. But Thomas insists he does. And his claim is simple but devastating. Meghan has been reinventing herself long before the royal spotlight. She wasn't just stepping into a new life. She was erasing parts of the old one. Now, why would someone do that? What pushes a person to bury their past so deeply that even their legal identity may have been rewritten? That's the question pulling at everyone who heard Thomas speak. And it's the question we're going to explore. Think about it for a second. Public figures reinvent themselves all the time. Celebrities change stage names. Politicians polish resumes. Even royals have done it. Remember, Queen Elizabeth's father was born Albert but became George VI. But there's a line between performance and paperwork. You don't casually use a different name on government or legal documents. That's not reinvention. That's a different life altogether. And Thomas, with the kind of weary resignation only a father could have, claims he's been watching this unfold for years. His silence, he said, was partly loyalty, partly fear, partly exhaustion. But this latest lawsuit filing, the spark that set him off, was the breaking point. And he decided the world had to hear the truth, straight from him. Now let's talk about that lawsuit, because this is important. Legal filings surfaced, new ones, tied to ongoing disputes. Dry paperwork, yes, but the kind that often contains the small details that snowball into scandals. Something in those pages, according to Thomas, was the final straw. He didn't say it outright in that first moment, but you could see it in his face. He felt cornered. He felt like his daughter had crossed a line too many. And in his mind, the only way to fight back was to shatter the image she had built by exposing the most intimate of truths, her identity itself. Imagine the silence in that live chat when he said it. Thousands of eyes glued to the screen. Typing stopped. Emojis frozen mid-scroll. Everyone waiting for the next line. Because when a parent makes a claim like that, about their own child, it isn't gossip. It isn't hearsay. It's nuclear. It's the kind of statement that lives on the internet forever. And Thomas knew that. He chose to say it anyway. But here's where things get even more explosive. He didn't just say Meghan used another name. He implied that this other name was part of a pattern, a history of reinvention that Meghan has carried with her for decades. She wasn't always Meghan Markle, he said. And that's the dagger. Because Meghan has built an empire around that name. The books, the interviews, the documentaries, the royal title. Everything she stands on is tied to the brand Meghan Markle. Strip that away, or even cast doubt on it, and the entire empire wobbles. And so, in that moment, the audience wasn't just shocked. They were unsettled. Because this wasn't about who Meghan married, or how she acted in the palace, or even her relationship with the press. This was about identity itself. And when identity is questioned, everything else, every decision, every statement, every promise, suddenly comes under suspicion. Let's be real here. If Meghan truly did use another name on official documents, it opens up a storm of possibilities. Was it for personal reasons? Was it to escape something? Was it to reset her story? Or was it something darker, like concealing truths the world wasn't supposed to know? And that's the rabbit hole we're about to go down. Because the moment Thomas dropped that claim, it stopped being about a father lashing out and started being about a global mystery. Who is Meghan Markle really? Now, before you jump to conclusions, remember this. Thomas Markle has a history of dramatic statements. Critics will say he's bitter, resentful, even manipulative. They'll dismiss him as a man desperate for attention. But think about this carefully. If he were only seeking attention, why aim this low blow? Why risk legal consequences, public backlash, and permanent estrangement from his daughter? The easier route would have been to throw shade, to gossip about relationships, to comment on royal life. But no, he went for the jugular. He attacked the one thing Meghan cannot escape, her name. That choice wasn't random. It was calculated. And as you'll see in this story, calculated moves like this don't happen in isolation. They're triggered. They're built up over time. And they carry consequences that stretch far beyond one live video. Because if Thomas is right, and that's the haunting possibility, then Meghan's entire royal saga has been built on a version of herself that doesn't exist. And that revelation, my friends, is why this story matters now. So ask yourself this. Why would Thomas Markle choose this moment to speak out? Why tie his daughter's alleged secret identity to a lawsuit filing? And why risk everything, his reputation, his credibility, even potential legal trouble, to say it live and censored, unfiltered? These aren't the actions of a man just seeking headlines. These are the actions of a man who feels cornered, a man who believes the world has been fooled for far too long. And that's where we begin. With a father staring down the camera, his voice sharp, his message sharper. She wasn't always Meghan Markle, he said. And then he paused. The silence was deafening. The chat went wild. And the world was left wondering. If she wasn't Meghan Markle, then who was she? And more importantly, what was she hiding? Because what Thomas hinted at in those opening minutes wasn't just a personal grudge. It was the start of an unraveling. The kind of unraveling that could peel back the layers of one of the most famous women in the world. The kind of unraveling that leaves audiences on the edge of their seat, desperate for the next piece of the puzzle. And make no mistake, the pieces are coming, each one sharper than the last. But before we dive into the papers, the lawsuits, and the trail of reinvention, let's stay in that moment just a little longer. Because that moment, Thomas Markle on camera, eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a tight line, is the fuse. And when a fuse is lit, there's only one outcome: explosion. What follows is not just a story of family betrayal. It's not just a story of legal drama. It's a story of identity, deception, and the haunting question that lingers long after the live stream ended. Who is Meghan Markle really? And the answer? Well, let's just say what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The notification popped up like any other. A simple alert: Thomas Markle is live. Most people probably thought it was another quiet, rambling session. Maybe a father venting about estrangement. Maybe just background noise. But within seconds, it became clear this wasn't ordinary. This wasn't casual. This was a man with something heavy on his chest, and tonight he was going to unload it for the entire world to hear. Enough is enough, he began. The words landed like a hammer. No warm greeting, no small talk, no attempt at charm. Just those three words, blunt and sharp. And instantly, the live chat came alive. Questions scrolled. People spammed emojis. Some laughed, some gasped, some begged him to spill it already. Think about it. How often do you see a father, especially one estranged from his daughter, go live to drop a bombshell? It's uncomfortable. It's raw. It's unfiltered. But that's exactly why people couldn't look away. The shock factor wasn't just in what Thomas said. It was in how he said it. Calm. Cold. Like a man who had rehearsed this in his head 1,000 times, but was only now letting it out. The camera was shaky at first, his voice uneven, but there was a fire in his eyes. He wasn't fumbling for words. He wasn't groping for attention. He was cutting straight into the heart of it. My daughter, he said, pausing to swallow hard, has built her entire life on a name that isn't the one she always used. And the world deserves to know. The chat exploded. Now let's pause for a second and picture yourself watching. Your heart skips. Your mind races. Because this isn't just some gossip columnist, not some random blogger. This is her father. Blood. Family. The man who held her as a baby, walked her through childhood, signed her school forms. If anyone would know the truth about documents, names, identities, it's him. That's what made it electric. That's what made it terrifying. Middle of the stream, Thomas leaned closer to the camera. His face filled the frame. Do you understand what I'm saying? He asked. Almost as if he wasn't talking to the chat, but to Meghan herself. His tone hardened. She wasn't always Meghan Markle. I've seen the papers. I've held them. And I can't sit back and watch the lies anymore. Boom. That was the moment the live stream stopped being background noise and became a global event. Clips began circulating before he even finished his sentence. Screenshots popped up on Twitter, TikTok, YouTube. Within minutes, hashtags like #WhoIsMeghan were trending. Journalists scrambled. Commentators sharpened their takes. The digital wildfire had begun. But let's not miss the smaller details here, because they matter. Thomas wasn't yelling. He wasn't ranting. He wasn't drunk or rambling. He was precise, measured, every word chosen like ammunition. That tone, that delivery, it gave weight to his claim. It made people lean in, because if he had come across unhinged, people would have dismissed it. Instead, his calm demeanor made the revelation land harder. And yet, there was something else too, a bitterness under the surface, like years of frustration boiling over. This wasn't a man suddenly lashing out. This was a man who had waited, stewed, agonized, and finally reached his breaking point. He didn't stumble into this confession. He walked into it deliberately, and that made it even more chilling. The chat, meanwhile, was in chaos. Some begged him to clarify. Others demanded receipts. Skeptics accused him of lying for money. Supporters urged him on, desperate for more. One comment flew by. If this is true, Meghan's entire story is fake. Another screamed, show the papers. And Thomas just sat back in his chair, letting the storm rage while he kept control of the narrative. Now here's where it gets interesting. Instead of immediately showing evidence, Thomas chose to tell a story. A memory, years old. He spoke of filling out forms, watching Meghan use a different name. He didn't say exactly what name. He didn't show the document, at least, not yet. But he laid the groundwork. Enough to plant doubt. Enough to make millions wonder. Had Meghan's entire identity been carefully constructed long before the palace, long before Hollywood, long before Harry? That's what gave the live stream its power. Not just what Thomas revealed, but what he refused to reveal. He dangled it, teased it, let the audience stew in uncertainty. And that uncertainty is what spread like wildfire. Because mystery is a stronger fuel than fact. He knew that. He used it. And so, minute by minute, the tension built. He reminded viewers of Meghan's ambition, her climb through Hollywood, her shift into royal life. She always wanted to be someone bigger, he said, his eyes narrowing. But what people don't realize is, she already started by being someone else. Let that sink in. For the chat, it was like being strapped into a roller coaster climbing its first hill. Everyone knew a drop was coming. The only question was, how far and how fast? The middle portion of the live stream turned almost theatrical. Thomas repeated phrases, letting them echo. Not the name you think. Not the person you think. His voice dropped lower, forcing viewers to lean in, straining to catch every word. That's a technique seasoned broadcasters use. But Thomas isn't a broadcaster. Which means either he stumbled into it naturally, or he knew exactly what he was doing. The live numbers ticked up. Thousands became tens of thousands. And every one of them was waiting for the same thing, the reveal. But Thomas didn't give it. Not yet. Instead, he shifted. He talked about lawsuits, about lies, about being tired of silence. He spoke of betrayal, not just his, but the public's. "You've all been sold a story," he said, "and it isn't the truth. I should know. I was there at the beginning." That's the part that hit hardest. Because suddenly this wasn't just about Meghan's name. It was about the narrative we've all consumed. The documentaries, the interviews, the carefully polished brand. Thomas wasn't just calling out his daughter. He was calling out the entire global stage that bought into her version of events. And in that moment, the live stream became something bigger. It wasn't just family drama. It was a reckoning. As the stream neared its end, Thomas grew quieter, almost solemn. "I've said what I need to say," he murmured. "But this is only the beginning. People will see. People will know." And with that, he ended it. No fireworks. No shouting. Just a father clicking the button, leaving millions stunned in silence. But here's the cliffhanger, the part that made this live stream unforgettable. Thomas didn't name the name. He didn't hold up the papers. He left it dangling. Which means the world is now split in two. Those who think he's lying, and those who think he's holding the key to Meghan's real identity. And that, my friends, is why this live stream wasn't just another bitter outburst. It was the spark, the ignition, the moment the question was planted. If she wasn't always Meghan Markle, then who was she? What came next? Well, let's just say it all started with a dry lawsuit filing. And no one, not even Meghan, could have predicted how that filing would blow the lid off everything. Scandals don't appear out of thin air. They need a spark, a fuse, something that shifts a private grudge into a public firestorm. For Thomas Markle, that spark came from an unlikely place, a stack of dry, legal filings. On paper, they looked like any other lawsuit documents. Pages of jargon, legalese, dates, signatures. Boring. But hidden between the lines, there was something that cut Thomas to the bone, something that, in his mind, left him no choice but to go live and say, "Enough is enough." Let's slow down here and set the scene. The court system isn't glamorous. It doesn't come with flashing lights or dramatic music. But lawsuits have a way of dragging secrets out of the shadows. Every motion, every filing, every sworn statement is a chance for the past to crawl back into the present. And in Meghan Markle's case, her past has always been her most dangerous battlefield. The new filings weren't just about money. They weren't about property. They weren't even about her and Harry directly. They were about credibility. Reputation. The kind of fight where even the smallest inconsistency can explode into a full-blown scandal. And according to Thomas, those papers contained exactly that, inconsistencies. Little cracks in Meghan's story that, to him, confirmed what he had been holding back for years, that she hadn't always been who she claimed to be. Now, think about the timing. Thomas has been relatively quiet for stretches. Sure, he's given interviews. He's made comments. But he hasn't sat in front of a camera and unleashed something like this in a long time. So why now? Why tie his bombshell to these filings? The answer lies in the nature of lawsuits themselves. They are permanent. They are public. They can't be spun or erased. If something appears in those records, it lives forever in black and white. And Thomas knew that. So, picture him, sitting in his modest home, maybe scrolling through headlines about the lawsuit. He sees a phrase, a date, maybe even a name that doesn't match what he remembers. Maybe it's a filing that references Meghan's education, her legal standing, or background details. To most readers, it's nothing. To Thomas, it's déjà vu. It's a reminder of the documents he claims to have seen long before Meghan became a global name. And suddenly, it clicks. The world doesn't know. The world still believes the polished version. And unless he says something, the truth will remain buried. That's when the anger set in.